during the discussions will inform the policy briefs that we hope will be incorporated into recommendations for the G20 summit. Now, just to let you know that the Q&A is open, and you're very welcome to post any comments or questions or recommendations at any time. We suggest you try and keep them as brief as possible, and when we have an opportunity during the panel discussion, we may come back to some of those points. Now, just to be aware, we're always at the mercy of the internet, so we hope things will run smoothly. We have a lot of amazing speakers joining us from all around the world, so we hope that it goes smoothly, fingers crossed, but please bear with us. So I'd like to thank you all in advance for your generosity and your willingness to join us on this journey to the G20 and to contribute to this really important discussion today. Just before we get going, I really do want to thank Alia and the team at the University of Indonesia for all their help. We often do these thank yous at the end, but they kind of get rushed. I'd also like to thank my colleagues Chin Lu Cheng and also Lu Putu Wulandari from the Kirby Institute for all of their amazing help as well. So maybe, Eddie, I might just hand over to you now if you wanted to also say a few words.
Thank you very much, Virginia. Just basically to welcome you all as well. I think we have the potential of a great discussion, which, as Virginia mentioned, is part of a process not only within the G20, but in the world at large. And I think that the response from you all and also from invited speakers, sometimes you just have to go and really pressure people to come in and talk, given the fact that their expertise, but this time it was really no problem. So I think, again, in advance, I think that's a very good thing to do, actually, thanking your co-workers in advance. Thank you for the speakers. Thank you for those who are attending, and also for all the people from Kirby and from the University of Indonesia, and particularly Professor Hasbullah and Virginia. But I will thank you again at the end. But just as they say, let's all break a leg.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Eddie. Thank you very much. All right. Well, without further ado, I think we'll get underway. And it's with great pleasure that we're able to hear today from a representative from the Ministry of Health in Indonesia. This is Dr. Rizka Anadalisia, who is the Director General for Pharmaceuticals and Medical Devices. As I said, we're very fortunate to have her here today to speak to us, and over to you.
Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, honorable speakers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to introduce. I am Rizka. I am from Indonesia Minister of Health. Now I am appointed to become the DG of Pharmaceutical and Medical Devices. Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity to invite us to join with this discussion and share about the ensuring quality and accessibility of COVID-19 RDT and also nucleic acid amplification tests in Indonesia. As Indonesia assumes the G20 presidency this year under the theme of Recover Together and Recover Stronger, Indonesia promotes the strengthening of global health architecture. That include the initiative from T20 Task Force 6, with one of the focuses in equitable access and production of diagnostic, therapeutic, and vaccine to confront COVID-19 globally. Let me introduce our regulatory in RDT and also NAAT testing regulation. As we know, the cause of death vary significantly between countries, and non-communicable disease dominate in rich countries, whereas infectious disease remain high at lower incomes. The world is making progress against infectious disease as the advancement of the rapid diagnostic test technology. The fast result from RDT allow us to get treatment faster. Faster treatment also can reduce the severity of the symptom and may help prevent the spreading of the disease. Indonesia MOH now building a stronger health system by introducing 6 pillars of transformation. If we focus on the third pillar on the health system resilience transformation, the government together with academic, business, and community and think tanks can accelerate the resilience, the leverage in the national local production of pharmaceutical and medical devices, and also in vitro diagnostic as well, especially the essential ones needed for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and responses. Let me share our process in medical device regulation scope in Indonesia. For medical device, the government of Indonesia regulate the whole life cycle of the devices based on its risk, starting from the research and development until the safety uses and destruction. Every medical device have to obtain product license before they enter the market in Indonesia, and the manufacturer and distributor must meet the good manufacturing practice and good distribution practice to obtain their license. These policies are implemented to ensure the safety, and efficacy, and also the quality performance of the devices. In post-market surveillance, there will be assessment, inspection, and testing as means of control and surveillance. These actions are to monitor the compliance of the medical devices with the standard and prevent any adverse event or error that can risk in human life. And all of these activities are strengthened, especially during the pandemic, with the introduction of RDT antigen for COVID-19. As I mentioned before, that all medical devices must obtain product license before enter the market in Indonesia. This is stated in Regulation of Minister of Health number 62 of 2017. Specific of RDT, the Minister of Health set out several criteria to ensure quality and accessibility of COVID-19 RDT, including the product must have license, and also EUL from WHO or EUA from US FDA or EMA, or RDT antigen must have validity test result with sensitivity above 80% and specificity above 97%. In regards of the validity test, the MOH appointed several testing laboratories in university-based and also our laboratory central. We have 8 laboratory referral for testing the RDT before enter to the market. And also we set the RDT antigen testing. New submission and renewal of product license for COVID-19 RDT and also a nucleic acid amplification testing must enclose validation testing results from at least from one appointed laboratory listed. After product license have been released, manufacturer must perform post-market validation testing for COVID-19 RDT in 2 different appointed laboratories and report the result to Minister of Health. If there is a discordant result, 2 different validation testing results, the product must be validated in National Reference Laboratory. A warning will be given if the products are substandard and further could be recalled. With the limited number of the laboratories listed and the ever-changing situation from the COVID-19 itself, the government pursued to strengthen the laboratory network to ensure the implementation of the regulation on RDT validation testing. Routine lab monitoring and evaluation are performed to update the policies available. Moreover, government also enforced the creation of R&D based medical device and pharmaceutical manufacturing ecosystem. Indonesia invited researchers and manufacturers from overseas to have their development and production of products done in Indonesia. This could be in the means of transfer technology, joint venture, and other form of cooperation. As the co-chair of the chair of the G20 Health Working Group 3 that will be held this month in Bali, allow me to reiterate the urgency and importance of creating a more equal opportunity and ability to develop, produce, and distribute PTD globally. The Health Working Group aims to strengthen the ecosystem that will provide fertile soil for the timely and safe manufacturing and research system to prepare and respond to the future global health threats. I think this is our presentation, and also my introducing about the Health Working Group 3 will be a health meeting in Bali next in the end of this month. I sincerely believe it is time for us to take a global health state. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iska. It was a great start to the webinar. I think particularly is sort of focus in on the policies and the manufacturing processes in Indonesia. We thank you very much. Now what I'd like to do is continue moving through our speakers for this first session on vaccines, therapeutics and diagnostics. I should also say that I hope that if our colleagues from the Indonesian Ministry of Health are able to stay during the webinar, we'd be very happy to involve them in our panel discussion towards the end. So thank you for that wonderful opening. So okay, our first speaker for this session is Dr. Sumya Swaminathan. Sorry, my pronunciation is not very good. This presentation is recorded, and just in terms of background, I'm not going to be able to give a detailed bio for each of our presenters. There's just too much to say. But if I could just mention that Sumya was appointed as WHO's first chief scientist in 2019 and brings enormous experience to the discussion today. She was also the first Director General of the Indian Council of Medical Research between 2015 and 2017. Just before we switch over to her short presentation, could I ask those that perhaps aren't speaking to mute their mics? Thank you. Okay, over to you, Alia. Just bear with us for a moment while we try and get the presentation up and running.
Kenapa nggak bisa share sound ya? Jangan-jangan ada yang diganti.
Ali, I wonder, maybe we could move on to the next presentation while you try and get the recorded. Oh, okay.
I think I couldn't hear any sound.
That's right. Alia, we might move on to the next presentation and then come back to the WHO, if that's all right.
Yeah, I think it's okay, Dr. Julia. We're still trying to do this. Yeah, please carry on, Dr. Julia.
Okay. All right. Apologies for that problem. There's apparently quite a bit of rain in Indonesia right now, and it's affecting the internet connection. So, James, I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but I'd like to move over to Mr. James Love, who's the Director of Knowledge Ecology International. And again, another very long, impressive bio that we're going to put up on our T20 website. But just very briefly, James has a background in economics and financing. He's advised many different UN agencies and governments, and I think a particular interest in development and pricing of health technologies. So over to you, James.
Thank you very much. Today I wanted to start by talking about briefly about the June 17th decision by the WTO, and in particular, the part of the decision that said that they're going to address the issue of therapeutics and diagnostics within 6 months. And in that respect, I want to discuss a paper we published about 2 weeks ago having to do with the U.S. government use authorizations for COVID-19 countermeasures. And then I wanted to segue to the negotiations of the World Health Organization on a pandemic treaty. I'm going to try and share my screen to see if that works okay. Let's see. I'm not sure. Let's see here. If that works, I can. I'm a little bit of a loss here. Let's see here. This is the.
That's okay.
Can you see the,
yes, it's fine now.
Yeah, you're done.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Okay,
James.
and I'm sharing. Okay, I'm sharing that screen over there. I'm well, as you know, do you see this?
Yes.
You see the draft General Counsel decision of the TRIPS agreement? Is that what's on the screen right now?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just trying. I have two monitors. I'm a little confused. Okay. Well, the short bit is in, as you know, in June 17th this year, after a long extended negotiation at the WTO on what was initially a proposal to waive 40 articles of the WTO agreement relating to the supply of any countermeasure for COVID-19 on a temporary basis. So it was narrow in the original proposal was narrow in terms of limited to a single virus. And it was narrow in the sense that it was limited to a temporary waiver of WTO rules. It didn't go beyond waiving WTO rules. It didn't address, for example, any bilateral agreements or plurilateral agreements that took place outside of the WTO. It didn't change any national law, but it would have changed what WTO rules were as relates to intellectual property. But it was broad in the sense that it had to do with 20 articles in part 2 of the TRIPS and 20 articles in part 3 of the TRIPS. So everything dealing with the granting of rights and the enforcement of rights. The final decision was a much more limited outcome, dealing essentially with about a 20-word paragraph in one of the articles of the TRIPS agreement having to do with the exports under a compulsory license. It was a very limited waiver in several ways, in the sense that it was conditioned upon certain obligations on people that use this mechanism. It was also limited to the eligible countries, both from the exporting and the importing side. It was widely criticized by the people that were working on the access issues, including our organization and many others. It was a great disappointment in many ways compared to the original ambitions of what was proposed. That said, and it was also limited to only therapeutics in the June 17th version. That said, there was a paragraph in it said that they would be willing to extend this to make a decision on whether any aspect of this would be extended to therapeutics and to diagnostic tests, and that negotiation is currently going on. What I'm sharing right now is what we think is one way you could do that, and that would be, if you can see it very, very clearly, maybe I can zoom it in a bit there, but if that's a little better. But we thought like a one-sentence decision by the WTO, just saying that whatever they decided on June 17, without reopening any other issue that was raised, would be extended mutandis to diagnostic therapeutics, like a Latin phrase that says that you just basically take what the decision that you made for diagnostics and you essentially implement the same conditions and limitations to diagnostic and therapeutics. It's not a particularly ambitious proposal. It's a simple proposal, but it was, I think the idea was that not to reopen any of the other issues. For a little perspective, before June 17th, there were earlier versions of the text that were released that were quite a bit worse, actually, than the June 17th version in terms of being more restricted. So strategically, this was thought to be, by some people working on the decision, I think some countries are sort of also, this is like one alternative. This alternative, I think, is not, it would seem like a fairly straightforward thing to do, but there's no guarantee that even this will come forward. Now, the next thing I want to show you is our, let's see if I can, yeah, are you able to see this other document called KEI briefing note?
Yes.
Yes.
Government Spanish. Well, we have done some research on the contracts the U.S. government entered into in COVID-19 from the beginning of the pandemic. And I'm just going to get to the most important part. There is a law in the United States, go down to here, that's 28 U.S.C. 1498 is a general law in the U.S. that says that the U.S. government can use any patent it wants for any purpose it wants to aspire for the government, if they give essentially an authorization to a third party, they can use any U.S. government patent. And if they do, if you're the patent owner, the only remedy that you have if someone's using your patent without your permission is you can sue the U.S. government. You cannot sue the patent holder. and the US government bears the responsibility for paying the royalties, and there's no injunctions available or anything. Now, we really became important of how widely this was used when Mrna, who manufactures messenger RNA vaccines, was sued by 2 patent holders in the United States. And Mrna said that it had such an authorization for the US government for its messenger RNA that they essentially had a compulsory license to use any US government, any patent granted in the United States without the permission of the patent owner. We subsequently are in parallel, we're in litigation with the US government to get copies of contracts that were entered into on COVID-19, and we've received a very large number of contracts from the government under this Freedom of Information lawsuit. And so we searched these contracts, and what we were looking for is a reference to a regulation that the US has on what is titled Authorization and Consent. And if you read the first paragraph, it tells you how broad this is. It says that the government, meaning the US government, authorizes and consents to all use and manufacture in performing this contract or any subcontract at any tier of any invention described in and covered by a US patent. What this means is that if you have this authorization and consent from the US government, you're allowed to use any patent by anyone without, they don't have to be named or anything. It just covers all patents in the United States if you get the authorization and consent. Now, it's not easy to get the authorization and consent normally, because when the government does this, they assume responsibility, for example, for paying any compensation to patent owners, which is required. And it effectively breaks the patent monopoly. That said, we did know that it had been done in the case of Mrna, so we were kind of curious how often else it had been done. And the answer is we were able to identify 62 contracts where we could identify whether the authorization consent had been granted. And to our surprise, 59 of the 62 had given authorization consent to use third-party patents. Now, it's pretty easy in the United States. If you have a procurement contract or a research and development contract, you merely have to, in the second column, you merely have to reference this regulation that I just described, FAR 52.227-1. Now, there's different versions of it there. They're pretty similar, but they're distinguished usually by the dates. So in the authorization, they'll say, either the April 1884 version or the June 2020 version or something like that. And the companies that were involved, like we have pages and pages of these. This is the first column is the contract, who the contract is with. Like the first one up here is Novavax, which has a protein subunit vaccine. Eli Lilly is here, Merck is here, Sanofi's here. A lot of companies you've heard of, and not just in the also some universities, but not only in the not only famous companies, but companies you've heard, smaller firms, as well as companies in the diagnostic or the protective equipment phase or for therapeutics. And so you'll notice, for example, the Corning and Philips and companies like that, which are big giant companies, don't make vaccines, but they make other things that were used as countermeasures. We're including this. So, well, in Latin America, I was recently in Peru, and Peru is struggling to figure out how to use a government use authorization within the Andean Pact, which governs the patent regimes and exceptions regimes for Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. It's very difficult to do it there. In the United States, it's really, really easy. And the U.S. Now, Indonesia, during the pandemic, did expand the use of government use authorizations in Indonesia, and some other governments have done the same thing, but no one has done anything remotely close to what the United States government has done. I just wanted to point this out. In terms of
1 minute.
Okay, the last thing I want to mention is that We've been following the WHO negotiation on a pandemic treaty. And recently, I had the pleasure with several co-authors, a large group of co-authors, because Ellen Tahoen, Katrina Perdoff, KI, we convened an experts meeting on the pandemic treaty earlier in the year. And we identified a series of recommendations for the WHO negotiations on a pandemic treaty. And we were able to publish in BMJ Global Health this paper that which had 7 recommendations for things we'd like to see in the pandemic treaty. I think that, I guess I'm out of time, so I will mention that one thing that we think is really quite important is to have provisions in the pandemic treaty that go to the obligations on countries that fund research and development to acquire rights that can be used in a public interest way during a pandemic, and to share those rights with other members that are also part of the pandemic treaty. It's challenging because a lot of countries do not want to give up their intellectual property rights to other countries, because they think that, why should they do that if no one else is doing it? So one of the issues that comes up is, would there be reciprocal obligations in order to benefit from the sharing of IP that the other country would also have to share intellectual property rights in the research and development that it funded? Another topic we think is quite important is transparency was quite lacking in the current pandemic. It rapidly became basically a national security issue in a lot of areas. So a lot of the contracts that were involved were not transparent. And provisions on intellectual property, the pricing, the quantities, the conditions, all those things. And I think that it's difficult in the middle of a pandemic when everyone's sort of trying to fend for themselves and, put their country first, and becomes very nationalistic. But in terms of going forward, if you have an opportunity to not know who will be endowed with different assets or what things are going to look in the future, it may be easier to establish a better, more open framework, a more inclusive framework that's better for access. And we think this WHO negotiation pandemic treaty is extremely important. I'm out of time. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks so much, James, and thanks again for joining it at a very unpleasant hour. You've done incredibly well, and this document, I read it today. If I could encourage people to have a look, published in BMJ Global Health, it's a really great series of recommendations, and will certainly inform what we're doing for the G20. So thank you again, James. We're going to have to keep moving along rather swiftly. I think that we're going to give it another go. We're going to try and bring up the WHO presentation from Dr. Soumya. Over to you, Alia.
James, has to stop sharing.
Greetings from the World Health Organization. I'm Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, the Chief Scientist, and I wanted to describe and share my experiences during the COVID pandemic, and even before that, in my experience working with many countries on TB and HIV and other neglected diseases. As we all know, we are at a critical juncture of the COVID pandemic, where we're not out of the pandemic. In fact, the latest data from the submissions to WHO show that we still have over 6 million cases, so almost 1 million new cases every day, and about 14,000 deaths occurring every week. And this has been rising over the last 5 weeks due to the circulation of the new variants. So we still have a distance to travel before COVID hopefully becomes an endemic infection, where even though it's not eliminated, it's not going to cause disruptions to health systems. It's not leading to a lot of mortality, and it is not disrupting economies. The best case scenario, of course, is that it settles down into this type of pattern where, because of the immunity that has been built up through vaccination programs across the world, that there is a disconnect between infection and severe disease and death, and that we are able to live with COVID. But there's also a worst case scenario where it changes so much, it mutates so much that essentially it becomes almost like a new virus and is able to overcome the immunity that we currently have due to our vaccines, in which case it's almost as if the clock has been set back and we will have to start all over again in developing a vaccine for that new variant. So far, all the vaccines that have been developed have continued to provide high degree of protection against severe disease and death. Those are the outcomes we're interested in. But with every new variant, it has become more transmissible and more immune evasive, and therefore the protection against infection has been steadily going down. And this is why we see waves in many parts of the world today due to the circulating variants BA.4, BA.5, and a few other sublineages of Omicron. The pandemic has, I think, taught us many lessons on things that worked well, things that did not work well. In my experience, what worked well was that the science moved extremely rapidly, and the WHO was at the heart of this from the beginning, where we convened the first Global Research and Innovation Forum in February of 2020 and laid out a research roadmap for COVID, encompassing all aspects. And at that time, of course, almost everything about this virus, this disease, was an unknown. And since then, we have continued to work with scientists from around the world and doctors and academics through hundreds of committees, advancing the knowledge about the vaccine and disease. So tremendous amount of global collaboration and willingness to share information, share data. And a good example really is the sharing of genomic sequence data through this platform called Lancet and a couple of other platforms that are available for scientists to share the data. We have something like over 5 million whole genome sequences just of the Omicron variant, 12 million or so overall. And even though in the recent weeks, we've seen that testing and surveillance and submission of genome sequence data has reduced, but overall, we have been able to track the virus in real time, track its evolution, and each new variant has been detected with more and more efficiency at greater speeds. In fact, the Omicron variant was detected by the South African scientists literally within 2 weeks of the first cluster appearing in South Africa. Now, that is a tremendous advance. And I think it's the first time that we have been able to track pathogen in real time. Now, this has tremendous applications, of course, for other pathogens. Why should we not be able to do this for tuberculosis, or for malaria, or for dengue, or for cholera, or for some of the foodborne infections that are so common? So I think we have the technology, we have a growing group of scientists and bioinformaticians. Of course, there are many countries where still this expertise doesn't exist. It needs to be trained. But I think investing in genomic capacities today is going to be very useful for the future, not just to track and deal with infectious diseases, but also the application of these genomic technologies in other areas of health, in prevention of cancer, for example, by identifying genes which make people susceptible to cancer, or for the treatment potentially of diseases like sickle cell anemia, using gene editing technologies. All of these applications will be possible with investments in genomic technologies. And so the WHO Science Council recently released a report on the applications and uses and makes a case for countries to invest in this. So this, I think, was a good example. The other good example I could say is that the way the clinical trials were done, especially the large platform trials like Solidarity, like Recovery, these trials actually gave us information about whether a certain drug works or does not work to treat COVID-19 in a rapid, efficient manner, and also in an inclusive manner where multiple countries were participating in these trials. And so even if you saw the epidemic curve reducing in one part of the world, in other parts of the world, they could still be enrolling patients. So again, I think it's a good model for us to study other diseases, non-communicable diseases or communicable diseases, which are public health problems, by doing these large platform trials to advance the knowledge. Could be for new drugs, or could be even for testing out strategies for controlling these diseases. I think the third area where we was a challenge, but we had to really do well, was in adapting our guidelines. And we have moved into something that we call the living guidelines approach, where we constantly update the recommendations based on the evolving knowledge and the new data that's coming out through updating our systematic reviews and putting out these. So for example, for COVID treatment guidelines, we've had 11 updates, 11 iterations. It's all available on a digital platform, and the data that's behind this recommendations get published at the same time as the recommendations come out. So it is our hope that such a living approach can be used for other diseases as well, and that this could then be translate actually into sort of decision support tools in countries in the hands of health workers. The fourth area I would say is in communication. I think all governments, scientists, the WHO, everybody has really been challenged with the need to communicate in a manner that is factual, that is transparent, that is explaining what is currently known, but at the same time with the humility of accepting that we are faced with an unknown or a new pathogen, and things change and evolve as a new science develops. We have to change our policies, change the way in which we do things. That has been a bit confusing for the public, and many analyses done have shown that those countries where there was a high trust in government are the ones that actually had the lowest COVID mortalities and impact on people. So I think investing in communication of complex problems and challenges to the public in an easily understandable way, and also being able to communicate what actions and steps they should take and what steps the governments are taking, I think really helps. And this was also true with the rollout of vaccines. In some countries, vaccine hesitancy has actually prevented 30-40% of the population from taking the vaccines, even though they were widely available. And this obviously results in a situation where a lot of susceptible people still exist in the community, can get sick. Today, we have over 12 billion vaccine doses that have been delivered worldwide to people. That is a record, actually, in a year and a half since the first vaccines were available. And such a massive vaccination program, development and the deployment of vaccines has actually really been more than anybody's expectations. The fact that the virus turned out to be one where multiple vaccines could successfully be developed was also something that we were lucky with. For the future, we will have to invest in platforms on what we call the priority viral families. There are about 23 or 24 viral families from where the pathogens can come, which can cause future epidemics and outbreaks. So the goal is to develop vaccine prototypes so that if there is an outbreak, it can be quickly adapted with a specific viral strain. With, of course, now with genetic sequencing, you'll get it very quickly, and therefore you should be able to produce a vaccine very quickly. But then, of course, it has to go through the clinical trials and testing, and that's where you need the regulatory harmonization. And that's, again, another thing I would say that worked well was that all of the major national regulators formed a consortium along with WHO to agree on the benchmarks, agree on the data sets that would be needed to provide emergency use authorization for vaccines. This really helps and speeded up approvals in countries. So all of these things are actually the positives. But as everybody knows, the major issue that we faced during the pandemic is the impact of the inequalities and inequities. Existing inequalities in society resulted that certain subgroups of the population suffered more than others, and in most countries, these were the most vulnerable, the most socioeconomically deprived segments of the population. In high-income countries, the ethnic and racial minorities, they had much higher death rates, for example, because of underlying comorbidities, but also because of lack of access to healthcare services. Then we saw the inequities in the access to health products. And even today, a number of African countries have not vaccinated even 20% of their population, whereas globally, about 68-69% of the population has been fully vaccinated. And there is a gradient, and high-income countries have had about 10 times more rate of vaccination, but the same lack of access applies to diagnostics and therapeutics and PPE and other health products. So the one factor that is most explains this inequity is the manufacturing capacity. And those regions of the world which are entirely dependent on importing products, particularly the African continent, but also many countries in Latin America, they actually were the ones who had to wait in line and did not have access at the beginning of 2021, despite all the efforts made by the WHO, made by through the ACT Accelerator, the COVAX facility with Gavi, UNICEF, etc. So this is why we now have the program of the technology transfer hubs and spokes, where starting with mRNA technology, but hopefully extending to other technologies, we can ensure that in the future there will be distributed manufacturing across different regions of the world, and this will then obviously provide regional health security. Now, every country in the world does not need to and should not become a vaccine producer. This is not financially sustainable. And even with the hub and spokes, there is a lot of work that needs to be done really on establishing how to make these financially sustainable, what kinds of investments will be needed, and what kinds of commitments will be needed from regional bodies and global procurement agencies to procure vaccines that are going to be manufactured by these new sites. The other thing that will happen as part of this is, of course, the training of the global biomanufacturing workforce with a hub that's been established in South Africa, but more regional hubs need to be established, as well as the regulatory capacity strengthening of countries which want to become vaccine manufacturers. We also hope that a vibrant system of R&D, of networks of scientists who work together on mRNA technology or on other technologies can enable more of South-South collaboration and ultimately a network that will develop vaccines and other biologics and health products for the populations that need them. The mRNA technology has a lot of potential to be used for the manufacture of these types of biologics, and ultimately it is the empowerment of the scientists in these countries and the democratization of knowledge with the sharing of technology and know-how that will lead to affordable and accessible health products and also, of course, contribute to regional health security. So this is something that we would like very much the G20 to support, but this is a beginning that has been made, and a lot of thinking and a lot of work needs to really go into how these networks are going to be operating in the future, how they will be sustainable, and also trying to develop a roadmap for each of them actually to succeed in the future. So there's still a long road to travel, but we know that there will be more outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics, and therefore the best time to prepare is now. Even though we haven't come out of COVID, we still need to start putting in place these systems so that if and when we are challenged, for example, now by monkeypox, then we are facing actually a similar situation of a lack of vaccine, a lack of drugs, and also a real underinvestment in R&D in a disease which primarily was endemic in a few African countries. So I think we also have to change the way in which we prioritize and invest in research and development for diseases, because we know that we live in a world, in a globalized world, where diseases can spread around the world extremely quickly in a matter of hours, and therefore no one is safe until everyone is safe. And if we really believe in that principle, then we need to work with global solidarity and collaboration in order to solve some of these challenges, which are global challenges. And with that, I thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swaminathan. I think that manufacturing is going to certainly be an issue that's going to cut across many of our presentations today. It was really interesting to hear about the technology transfer hubs as well, and to hear priority recommendations from the WHO. I'd also like to acknowledge Claudia Nanai, who's also joined us from the WHO. So Claudia, if you are around for the panel discussion, it'd be great to have you involved, and also please feel free to post any comments in the Q&A, Claudia and everybody. We will need to move on in the interest of time. So we've heard about vaccines access, we've heard about therapeutics. Now we're going to switch to Rosanna Pearling. Professor Pearling has a chair in diagnostics and research, diagnostics research at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where she's also director of the International Diagnostics Centre, and is head of, has been head of diagnostic research at UNICEF, UNDP, WHO. As I said, people's bios will be on the T20 website, and I can't do justice to all of them now, but thank you, Rosanna. Over to you.
Thank you, Virginia. And I'd like to begin my presentation by thanking the organizers for giving me the opportunity to share with you. Sorry, I don't know why it advanced automatically, to share with you my experiences and recommendations for improving access to diagnostics. I think we've all been familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, where we hope that we will reach universal healthcare by 2030. Now, access to diagnostics really could enhance the quality of care, especially in countries where laboratory infrastructures are limited. We need to find other ways to improve access. Now, in terms of what the pandemic has taught us, is that pandemics actually don't create new problems. They just make us face the problems that we've long ignored. And so I think we're all familiar that COVID has really exposed the fault lines in healthcare systems in every country, including high-income countries, and that inequities in access to life-saving commodities for marginalized populations have been very common. And that's something we need to really address. And it's more than just inequality that we need to be looking deep into the reasons why there's lack of access. And I think that most of us are familiar with the fact that there's such a global competition for supplies, for different life-saving commodities, that we realize that there has to be more manufacturing facilities, more development facilities. But as Dr. Sumir from WHO has said, we are not advocating that every country would develop and manufacture life-saving commodities like vaccines, drugs, and diagnostics. But we really need to think of global, regional, and national solutions. I think throughout the pandemic, we've had a new understanding of what it's meant by public. I think in the past, when we talk about public health, we often think of informing the public on what they need to do. But this pandemic has really taught us that the public should be given the knowledge and the tools to do their part in the pandemic and not just be told what to do. Now, very early on in the pandemic, access to diagnostics was already written about. And this is taken from a Nature article that's written by John Nkengasong, the director of the Africa CDC. He said that African countries have funds to pay for reagents for diagnostics, but cannot buy them. And he's not the only one. I've been contacted by countries in Latin America that says we have the money, but somehow our dollars are not as good as other countries' dollars. And so this is a really important issue that we need to look at. Now, despite the fact that there was a creation of the Access to COVID-19 Tools Act A, which is the accelerator for access to these tools. A lot of inequalities and inequities remain, especially for vaccines and to a lesser extent to diagnostics, so that we realized that in Africa, in the end, they were only able to access diagnostics after there was the orders have been filled by a lot of other countries. And I think that we need to look at the global competition for reagents, but we also need to look at in country, what are the reasons why there is no access for diagnostics for most of the population. I think in a lot of countries, in low and middle income countries, there was a lack of capacity to perform molecular tests, so that even though they have access to reagents, they may not be able to do testing as in a timely manner, so that the public have very little access to molecular testing and wait for weeks for the results, or in some cases not at all. There was a second reason why access to diagnostics by the public was delayed, and that's because I was told by the first company that got WHO emergency use authorization and FDA emergency use authorization for their rapid antigen tests in order to scale up testing. The president of the company told me that 60 countries actually demanded independent studies to evaluate these diagnostics, despite the WHO and FDA endorsement of emergency use. And so I think that's another issue we need to look at. And then in a lot of countries also, there was a lack of distribution mechanisms during the pandemic. Now, we're all familiar with many countries having supply chain issues and have stockouts regularly of life-saving commodities. So again, this was exacerbated during the pandemic. Now, what can be done? I like to cite this very important publication and then two other advances that would allow us to make recommendations to go forward. First, the Lancet Commission on Diagnostics published their findings in October of 2021. And in it, no surprise, 47% of the global population has little or no access to diagnostics. And this is diagnostics for both infectious diseases and non-communicable diseases as well. And as an example of the potential impact of having access to diagnostics, they found that if countries can prioritize access to diagnostics, even for 6 conditions, they could save 1.1 million lives in low and middle income countries each year. So expanding the production of diagnostics by locating more research, development, and production in low and middle income countries is a key priority that's recommended by the by the Commission. And the Commission also said that innovations within the last 15 years in many areas in terms of financing, technology, etc., can reduce that diagnostic gap. Now, secondly, in the COVID pandemic, we actually had, for the first time, a lot of countries actually recommending self-testing. And WHO issued a guidance on self-testing to help countries with knowing what to recommend, how to make sure that there's reporting of the willingness to test, as well as reporting. Now, unfortunately, this is relatively new. There's still a lot of the public that suspect, self-tests as to whether it's good or not, and hesitant, and also reporting to public health authorities of their results, even in the UK, was less than 10%, although in some countries is more. And so I think that that's something we need to look at, because self-testing really empowers the individual to do their part in for their own health. And the other important infectious disease for which we have self-tests is HIV, although WHO is working at looking at other diseases for which self-testing would work, such as sexually transmitted diseases and others. Now, as we could see during the pandemic, there were technological advances that allow us to every day have access to data. And this is really important because the convergence of digitization, diagnostic technologies, information technologies, artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc., have really allowed us to have connected systems that allow testing data to be turned into intelligence in real time to inform control strategies. Now, digital technology has been really thought as a game changer for many aspects of healthcare. However, many countries actually were very slow to adopt it. And now, perhaps after the pandemic, maybe we would learn to use data display, such as these dashboards that you could see on the slide, a little bit more in terms of all areas of health, because these have the power to improve patient access, engagement, and improve outcomes. So now, what are our recommendations? In terms of the first recommendation, I think that governments often consider diagnostics as a cost to the healthcare system instead of adding value to the healthcare system. And so traditionally, diagnostics has been undervalued and underinvested. And so in the Lancet Commission, they actually modeled some of the investment that could be made. And they show that investment in diagnostics will pay for itself many times over, including those 6 priority conditions, which are HIV, syphilis, hepatitis, TB, and also diabetes and hypertension. Now, for every dollar spent on those 6 priority conditions, the savings could range from $3 to $24. So this is to show that investment in diagnostic will really pay for itself. Now, during the pandemic, we often heard that we should believe in the science. But during a pandemic, it's really hard to get the public and the politicians to trust in science because it's not something they're used to doing. And so this is something that we need to think about. How do we build trust? And so in terms of recommendations, what would be useful would be to have one, a really important area of research in diagnostics is to try to estimate the true value of diagnostics to patients and society as a whole. How do we make diagnostics add value by saving lives, increasing healthcare system efficiency, as well as reducing costs to the healthcare system, as we've shown with the Lancet Commission modeling. And then secondly, to use diagnostic data to set up data displays, such as dashboards that I've mentioned, to keep the public, politicians, and healthcare providers and other stakeholders informed of the latest trends in terms of what's happening, because this kind of transparency will engender trust and allow everyone to have the knowledge and the tools to do their part in the public health response. My second recommendation would be related to the need to incentivize the development, evaluation, and manufacturing of diagnostics for diseases of public health importance. And usually this is really relevant not only to a country, but to a region, because most regions share the same sort of endemic diseases, and diseases, as you know, could spread very quickly nowadays from one country to another. And so what we found also is that for diseases of epidemic potential, depending on what the disease is, you may have very little investment in these diagnostics for these diseases, because they are not, they don't create a viable market for industry. And so you could imagine that for Ebola, for diseases like Lassa fever, for West Africa, for meningitis, for the meningitis belt of Africa, they really are not viable markets for industry to invest in development of diagnostics. And also because they are diseases of epidemic potential, there's an inconsistent demand. And so most companies would shy away from it. The exception being this pandemic, where we have over 1,000 brands of diagnostics being made available. But that's only for a pandemic. For most diseases of epidemic potential, we need to think about other models other than dependent on market forces. And so, but we also found during the Ebola and Zika epidemics that the development of better diagnostics are only funded during the outbreak, but as soon as the outbreak is over, the funds are readily allocated to other priorities. And so that leaves the countries ill-prepared for the next outbreak for the same disease. So we really need to think about different models for development of diagnostics. And then we need timely development of guidance and access to specimens and quality control reagents for to facilitate test development and evaluation. And so our recommendation would be that governments and regional entities such as Africa CDC, such as PAHO and ASEAN and APAC, issue guidance on target product profiles in collaboration with WHO or other relevant partners, depending on where the outbreak is happening, and establish regional networks of biobanking and evaluation sites that have access to well-characterized samples. And one example that this has already happened was during the pandemic, the Africa CDC formed a biobanking network and published a guidance on it. And through a project that was funded by the Wellcome Trust to accelerate diagnostic access, we were able to facilitate the formation of other regional networks for Latin America and for Asia. So this is work that's ongoing. And then we need to think about product development partnerships, technology transfer, and local production agreements for more sustainable local production and access. And there are a few examples, for example, agreements between Brazil and South Korea in terms of diagnostics development and production. Diagnostics, which is started by the Institute Pasteur in Dakar in Senegal, in collaboration with the Fondation Mirieux, the Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics, and 2 industry partners. They were able to set up a platform for production of rapid diagnostic tests, starting with COVID, but going on to develop for Ebola, dengue, yellow fever, measles, rubella, and meningitis. So these product development partnerships are really important. They really depend on not only on more open intellectual property agreements, but also the trust of the international committee and as well as the countries on locally produced products. Because this has not been the trend, and we need to have these locally produced products help them reach international standards, so that everybody would have access to quality assured diagnostics. And then finally, the last recommendation, but not the least, is to accelerate regulatory approval and policy development to facilitate better deployment in a timely manner. The current access pathway has a long and fragmented and gaps, and the tests are first reviewed by regulators to assess risks, and then reviewed by policymakers to assess the incremental benefit for the acceptable risk, and then develop policies on how the test should be used, by whom, and who to act on the results. And as I mentioned, there are duplications in the evaluation of diagnostics that we need to overcome. And so we really need to think about different ways that we could overcome these barriers. And another area that I want to say is that regulatory science for diagnostics has not really kept up pace with technological innovation. And so we really need to think about how to do that, because, for example, self-tests for many countries, how to regulate self-testing, self-tests have not been fully developed. And also data connectivity that is on the diagnostics themselves, that needs a different kind of regulation, and that has not been kept up with the regulatory science for diagnostics. So our last recommendation would be to have neutral platforms for public and private sectors to interact to advance the regulation and access to novel technologies. And we started with our Wellcome Trust funded project to have a series of Health Technology Coalition webinar series to have these public and private interactions. We also advocate for the joint evaluation and review of diagnostic performance data by regulators and policymakers in order to save time and also to have a more balanced view of risks and benefits. And then WHO has been promoting regulatory reliance as well as convergence and harmonization. And this has worked very well for vaccines, but not very well for diagnostics. So more work needs to be done on that. And then finally, the last recommendation is to take all this together and develop in each country a connected diagnostic system that starts from the national reference lab at the top all the way to community-based testing and even self-testing. And this system should be the backbone of a healthcare system, which acts as the eyes and the ears of the healthcare system to provide early alerts of unusual trends in outbreaks and enabling rapid deployment of public health measures, as well as monitoring the effectiveness of disease control interventions. And this is more than just a surveillance system, because this can be applied to diseases or conditions other than diseases of epidemic potential. And with that, we could truly make diagnostics save lives, reduce healthcare system costs, as well as increase its efficiency. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rosanna. I think I really appreciate the way you've structured that, because it's going to hopefully make our job a little easier preparing the policy brief. So thank you for that. I think I probably heard over a dozen times the words health system. And I think that, you know, it's one thing to focus on the diagnostics, vaccines, therapeutics, but what is clear is that there is a lot of different elements of the health system that need to be strengthened in the process of achieving what we want to achieve with access to each of these technologies. So thank you very much. I'm going to move on now to our last speaker for this session, and that is Mr. Iqbal Habazon, who is the Policy Unit Officer at the Centre for Indonesia's Strategic Development Initiatives. And he and his colleagues work to develop policy summaries, recommendations in many areas, not only in health, I would imagine, and also provide timely advice to the Indonesian government during the pandemic. So over to you, Iqbal. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Virginia. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, let me share my screen first. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, let me start. Thank you, Professor Virginia, and thank you, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for all of you guys. My name is Iqbal, and I'm from CISD, Center for Indonesia's Strategic Development Initiatives. CISD basically is a think tank based in Jakarta, Indonesia. And now we are focused on the several public health development agenda, particularly in strengthening public health policies and also strengthening public health capacities in several regions in Indonesia. And today, let me present to you our presentations entitled Missions for Vaccines Equity, the case of Indonesia. So let me remind you that the COVID-19 crisis in Indonesia and all around the world basically has succeeded in demonstrating and also exacerbating the complexity of inequity. Despite Indonesia already managed its vaccinations target by 2021, its vaccinations program until now still progressing slowly in outreach the elderly groups and also the vulnerable groups. Based on our observations from our national vaccinations dashboard, there are only 10 provinces from 34 provinces in Indonesia that already reached 70% vaccinations target for the elderly and also the vulnerable groups. And also we highlighted that our government is still not prioritizing the vaccine supply for these groups in the context of vaccinations campaign. Our desk research on the global level, we highlighted a single phenomenon that right now the main problem of vaccine justice not only limited to the supply side problems, but also to the delivery side problems. WHO and World Bank highlighted many of 34 countries with less than 10% vaccinations coverage in January 2022 have struggled enough with consistent coordinations and engagements at the senior levels of government. So the data shows us that there's a need of strong leadership engagements if we want to create a concrete vaccinations program that oriented towards the vulnerable and elderly groups. Also from the UNDP survey in 2022, the problem of finance has always been an obstacle. UNDP estimated that the LIC's countries need to boost up their health budget up to 56.6% if they want to vaccinate 70% of their populations. It's from UNDP. So the data shows us that there's a need of increasing the amount, speed, and coordinations of funding, not only limited in the national level, but also from the global level, coming from the international partners. Also from WHO and World Bank, they also highlighted that the limited capacity of national health system led us to the limited ability of the countries to integrate their vaccination services into essential services. This data shows us that there's a need or there's an urgency to strengthen an investment of the primary healthcare as a part of the national health system to integrate COVID-19 vaccines alongside the other immunization services. When in the context of Indonesia, which is being centralized on our primary care. Okay, we are going to our national level. Basically, we already highlighted 4 challenges. It's coming from our series of focus group discussions with several vulnerable groups in Indonesia. So actually, there is a 3+1 challenge. On the community level, we still highlighted that the vulnerable groups in Indonesia are still facing several barriers in access the vaccine services. It's starting from the administrative matters, financial, infrastructure, informations, to cultural and socio-economic barriers, which make it more difficult for them to access vaccination services. Also, we highlighted that there is no specific regulations that already formalizing their representations in a program or policy designs of the vaccinations campaign itself. On the policy level, we still find the ambiguity of who the vulnerable groups are. Our government still not clearly defined by creating an operational definitions for the vulnerable group itself, nor a specific supply allocations for these groups also. And on the institutional level, we also highlighting the low level of political commitment on both on the national and subnational level of government, lack of leadership, and also siloed cross-sectoral coordinations as a part of the main institutional constraints to realizing those kind of initiative, which we try to push the vaccination campaign towards the vulnerable groups. Also on the communications and information strategy, we're still highlighting that our program, our national program, is still not accommodated the needs of the vulnerable groups in their communications and also information strategy design. And then upcoming from several problems, we want to introduce to you our proposals entitled Missions for Vaccines Equity. We believe that this approach could help global South countries, particularly in design to expand their vaccinations coverage for vulnerable groups. We also use the concept of mission-oriented policy framework from Mrna. There are at least 6 series of missions in realizing these proposals. Actually, it's 5+1 because 5 on the domestic level and +1 is coming from the global level. On the first missions, we believe that we have to strengthen the agency of vulnerable groups. We're already trying to ensuring a formal representations of vulnerable groups in Indonesia in several regions by involving them actively and meaningfully. We also trying to push there a concrete agreement or a concrete policy that could be formalizing the representative of the vulnerable groups in the policy design and also in the program design. Not only that, we also already identify and expand the definitions of vulnerable groups in the context of Indonesia's national vaccinations. And you can access the document on this link. Maybe later I will send it to the chat. So yeah, basically this it's coming from our evidence-based approach. And on the second missions, we also trying to establish a new framework of regulations that are also providing a technical guidelines. Three things that we have to make sure on this framework of regulations. First, the divisions of institutional roles across ministries and agencies, because it's very multisectoral when it comes to the vaccinations program. And the second one on the intersectoral coordinations and also cross-sectoral data management. And the third missions, we want to bolster an institutional capacity and commitment at the national and subnational level by conducting capacity building across national and subnational apparatus organizations on the governance process of the inclusive vaccinations program. What we want to do is we want to create the same sensitivity towards the vulnerability and vulnerable groups related to the vaccination campaign. And the fourth one, we want to push and develop the pentahelix governance model of vaccinations, which is already being our best practice in West Java, Indonesia, so-called PUSPA and PRIMA. And on the fifth missions, we want to encourage all countries, HIC, LMIC, and LIS countries to invest more in primary healthcare transformations. We believe that we need a huge movement to rejuvenate the central role of primary healthcare as a center of community that empowers people toward a people-centered healthcare approach. We also want to directing the primary healthcare transformations, not limited to the minimum services, but also by strengthening their quality of care through the investment in health workers. We also want to link and match this initiative with by strengthening of the digital health technology to ensure a supply chain logistic, including vaccines distributions, readiness, and management of health facilities. So the fifth, so there's 5 missions on the domestic level. It cannot be worked at the optimum level if we are not pointing out the 6 missions. So we want to encourage all international partners to provide more technical and financial assistance to LICs and LMICs countries sustainably. So we want to translate those missions into the framework, perhaps in the context of sustainable development goals, particularly on the point 3 on health, point 10 on inequalities, and also point 17 on the international cooperations. And also, we are looking for the new opportunity that coming from the upcoming financially intermediary fund, or FIF. We want to FIF in the future could support kind of initiative as reflections of peacetime investment spirit that already Indonesia's presidency already mentions in on this year's presidency. So going forward, we believe that by helping these countries to prioritize vaccinating those to high-risk groups or vulnerable groups within their national plans will have the most impact on reducing morbidity, mortality, and protecting health system. We believe that this initiative certainly requires commitment and support from all G20 countries, so the problems of vaccines inequity can be handled holistically. We also believe that this initiative can be utilized, not limited to the COVID-19 vaccinations, but by creating a concrete system, we also could urge those methods for the other vaccinations program, such as HPV vaccines, which is prioritizing now the Indonesia for the cervical cancers, or perhaps in the future monkeypox vaccinations. Therefore, we urge the importance of more inclusive pandemic response, which require a higher and stronger political leadership among country leaders to listen. As well, we demand for stronger G20 support in ensuring the continuity of efforts at the global, regional, national, and subnational levels in combating access to affordable, good quality, and safe COVID-19 vaccines. Okay, I think that's all for the presentations. Thank you for your attentions and good afternoon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Iqbal, and also Sunita, who's joined us as well, your colleague. Thank you very much. I think what's been really nice, particularly about the presentation that we've ended with there is understanding sort of the bottom up, the domestic sort of situation, understanding recommendations that have formed out of Indonesia's experience. So thank you very much. We now have a little bit of time for points of clarification. I do notice in the Q&A box, we had a few questions to James Love. Please, James, because of the timing for James, it is difficult, and he's not online at the moment, but we will certainly connect those questions to James and make sure that they're not left unanswered. But I also note that there is a question to Rosanna. Just before I do that, I wanted to note that we are about 15 minutes behind schedule, but we have one less speaker in the second half. So I think we will make our way back on track. So just taking a very couple of short questions at the moment. So Rosanna, I'm not sure if you've seen it, but there's a question here. Earlier you mentioned that the locally produced products are still not in the trend to be developed in countries. Could you explain what are the possible barriers to developing those products? And then there's a couple more questions underneath there. Maybe I can leave you to look at those.
Okay.
Or would you like
They're
me
in
to
the
read?
chat.
They're in the
Yeah.
Q&A, not the chat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of locally produced products, our experience with countries that try to have local production, say in Kenya, in other countries, is that quite often even the governments themselves prefer to buy foreign products because they believe foreign products are better than the locally produced products. And I think that's because they don't trust the regulatory system in the country to be able to distinguish between good and bad products. That's one thing. And then the other is that sometimes funding comes from, say, the Global Fund or other sources outside of the country. And as a condition of that funding, they may be tied to other diagnostics that have requirements and that are outside of the country. And so this is the difficulty that we found with trying to increase access through local production. And so that trend needs to actually be looked at. So the other one is for vaccines, about vaccines. So yeah.
Okay. All right. And then the last one, doesn't it also become a barrier for LMIC? They want to develop locally produced vaccines. Anyone want to speak to that from our presenter group? Maybe I could suggest that you could try and type some responses into the Q&A. But thank you, Anissa Putri, for that question. In the interest of time, we might just need to handle the first one and then move on to Grace. Grace has asked, it's a question to Iqbal. Can you see that question?
Yeah, sure.
Over to you.
Okay, I will answering live. Okay. The question is, do you find from your FGDs any hint whether similar situations and also your recommendations will also valid for access of diagnostic tools? Okay, probably so far our research is still limited on the vaccinations access. So we try to develop vaccines delivery services on the regional level. but yeah, so far the focus of the research itself is still limited to the vaccination. So yeah, actually I could not say it will be also impactful for the community. Yeah, I think that's it
Okay,
for the
great.
questions.
Thank you very much. And I don't know, Claudia, did you want to say anything in relation to the vaccines? Is there anything you want to add there?
Thank you, Virginia. Indeed, acceptance of locally produced products has demonstrated throughout several of our pandemics, but not only in the case of pandemics, so viruses that have generated a pandemic, also for other diseases, that it's less acceptable and has faced a lot of resistance in uptake. There are, I think, both Sumya and Rosanna addressed this issue in their talk. Building trust in the community is something you don't do during a pandemic, like we have seen. Having a strong national regulatory authority that ensures the quality, efficacy, and safety of these products is paramount to overcome certain resistance across populations. For sure, not prioritization of vulnerable communities, those that are normally left behind, and even emphasizes this mistrust in governments and health authorities. So that there is a lot of work that needs to start, and I agree with Iqbal, from the top. The political will, the political commitment, the higher level senior leadership of countries need to be upfront in the response to these pandemics, to ensure that to contribute, because it requires multi-stakeholder engagement, but to contribute to building trust in the communities and approaching from self-tests to vaccine with the reassurance that those products are of the highest quality and performance. I'm happy to also provide offline comments to these questions. Good question. Thank you.
That would be
Rosanna.
great. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you very much. And thank you for those questions. I think, again, in the interest of time, keep things moving because we have a lot of interesting discussions and presentations still to come. We're going to take a very short 5-minute break, but I would encourage you just to stretch your legs and grab a cup of tea or whatever it might be and join us back at 1:15. Yes, please don't go away for too long because we have some really excellent presentations coming up. Thank you very much.
Okay. I hope everybody's had a chance to have a break now, but I think we want to continue with our next set of speakers. As you will have seen, the webinar has been sort of divided in a couple of sections. We had some specific discussions on vaccines, medicines, and diagnostics, and now we want to sort of broaden it out a bit, how some of the various organizations around the world actually participate in this process, and in fact are lead proponents of this process. Similarly, we want to look at another important section of the global population about civil society, so civil society involved with these processes, and then, you know, what are some of the intellectual property and legal aspects of that. And finally, we're going to have a sort of a summary discussion from one of the speakers who's with a video at the end of this particular section. At the end of this section, again, we will have some time for clarifications before we launch into the discussions later on. So first of all, I'd like to call on Fatima Hassan to talk about the reaction of civil society and also intellectual property rights and legal aspects. And I would like to thank her very much for coming online. Fatima is a South African human rights lawyer and social justice activist. She's the founder of and heads the newly established Health Justice Initiative in South Africa. And she was a former executive director of Open Society Foundation for South Africa. Again, she has a long list of involvements in these and related areas. And so we thank her from that. I mean, to be quite honest, I was, again, at the beginning of COVID, having been involved with HIV for a long part of my career and going through the whole process of TRIPS, etc., and that through the Doha Declaration in 2001, we were able to bring, you know, affordable and quality assured antiretrovirals to lower middle income countries. So, you know, I've actually been rather flabbergasted that we have to go through the whole process again, seeing that the regulations there are very specific, they're generic, and they can be used. So part of the issue now, you know, apart from just focusing on what can we do for COVID, is again, are we going to go through these sort of processes every time we get a major global health problem? You know, do we do this very specifically for specific interventions or diagnosis? And for me, it doesn't really make sense. So apart from, you know, focusing also on COVID, this sort of, we hope that this webinar and what comes out of it does contribute to the whole process of actually developing access to medical technologies, irrespective of what the specific diseases. And this sort of also sort of ties in what the ADG from WHO mentioned earlier in her communication. Anyway, so no further ado, Fatima. we're all waiting for you. Thank you very much for coming and participating.
Sure, thanks, Edward, and thanks to the organizers for the opportunity. I'm assuming you can hear me okay? That's fine? Great.
Yes.
So I have no slides, but the host will insert some links to some articles that we've written around some of the developments in the last 2 years in particular, and you can have a look at our website for more information. So I have 10 minutes, and I really wanted to just give you a brief summary of the connections and I think the vigilance, given what Edward has said about us having to repeat sort of the struggles for access to life-saving interventions again, and none of us thought that we would have to do this, particularly in a global pandemic where a lot of countries and their leaders had offered us solidarity. And I've previously argued solidarity is just a word. COVID has proven that it's actually quite meaningless and it's not really a meaningful response to a pandemic of need and equity. So there are 4 elements that I wanted to touch on, which is health rights, human rights, unfair discrimination, and intellectual property. And Jamie has spoken quite a bit about the WTO TRIPS waiver process. I won't go into details of that, but I want to draw the link between those 4 elements, because until we address unfair discrimination within the context of an international trade regime and a system of trade rules that seeks to further deny timely, I think is really important, the timing of access to life-saving interventions. And we're not going to be able to advance what we all believe in, that health rights are, fundamentally a human right, and that there is an inherent acceptance that part of your health right has to be access to timely life-saving diagnostics, treatment, and vaccine. So when I use the word medicines in this presentation, I'm just going to be talking about all medical technologies. So Soumya has already, explained the devastating impact that we face in this pandemic, but I just want to reiterate that the WHO has said that at least 15 million lives have been lost. We think, obviously, that's an underestimate. We think it's more in the region of 20 to 25 million. But in the space of 2 years, we've had so much of death. And so the recognitions around how intellectual property or trade rules are supposed to respond to what's really effectively a season of death, and the fact that it's been so ineffectual and been so slow, I think, is a cause for concern. I mean, there's been trillions of dollars, if you want to quantify it in terms of US dollars, of damages to countries around the world, basically in terms of socioeconomic loss. There's been a poverty crisis, a hunger crisis. So the impact of what has happened in the last 2 years is not just on health and the ability to get people timely access to vaccines or, interruptions of TB and HIV treatment. It's basically resulted in a collapse of, I think, of the global economy and the way in which we as countries are going to have to respond to this, particularly for people who are vulnerable and poor. And unfortunately, Edward is right. What we thought was going to happen didn't, and despite all these promises. And what we saw in 2021 and 2022, frankly, was just a situation of vaccine apartheid. And currently we're seeing a situation of what we call treatment and diagnostic apartheid. And I'll explain some of the issues behind that a bit later. So if we are going to respond as civil society in a fundamentally different way to how world leaders responded to the issue of vaccine equity in the last 2 years, we really need to start, I think, hunkering down on how we're going to make sure that we get timely access to diagnostics and treatment for COVID, but then also for new HIV prevention injections, new revolutionary tools, possibly around TB testing as well. So there's a multitude, I think, of access battles that we're going to have to fight. But unfortunately, if your government or if another government insists that your government doesn't use available flexibilities that's contained in the Doha Declaration or partially contained in this new WTO deal, then nobody's going to get access to anything. And I'll talk about the mRNA hub later, because despite all of our excitement and optimism, I mean, it's set up down the road from me here in Cape Town, South Africa. If we don't deal with the IP barrier and the IP elephant in the room, then we're not going to be able to address the real pressing demand of meaningful access and meaningful equity right now. And just remember that Indonesia is also a spoke for the mRNA hub. So, very quickly on the very bad WTO deal, we'll post a link to an article I've written about it. And I think that the fact that it took 2 years to negotiate a really bad deal in the middle of a global pandemic that affected everyone everywhere with multiple variants emerging, when there were life-saving, safe and effective vaccines available quite quickly, quite early on with accelerated vaccine research off the back of public funding and public knowledge, I think was just a moral crime. And I think one day we could also argue a legal crime. But within the context of the WTO deal, which you'll remember there was a request for a full waiver of all IP elements, and IP is not just patents, it's also copyrights, it's trade secrets, it's confidential information, a number of the elements that would allow you to be able to scale up manufacturing of vaccines or treatment or diagnostic. It's not just the patents that we need to address. And what South Africa and India had asked was a temporary waiver of all IP elements for all COVID-19 medical technologies, just for the duration of the pandemic. What we got was a 2-year delay in negotiations, and then finally a deal which only waived one element of an international trade agreement, which deals with export restrictions. And basically, if you are able to manufacture, you can export an unlimited quantity, as Jamie has explained. They've no longer included a limit on that, and that's it. That's what we got after 2 years of death. And that's what we got after 2 years of vaccine apartheid. The deal doesn't even include treatment and diagnostics. So Paxlovid, self-testing, all of the great scientific innovations and advancements that people are talking about or is available to countries in the north, not available to countries in the south. And it's still going to be another 6 months about whether these countries think that those elements should be included in the deal. And already the US government is indicating, due to a lot of lobbying by pharmaceutical companies based in the US, that they would block any kind of extension of the deal to treatment and diagnostics. So if we want treatment and diagnostics to respond to COVID, we're going to have to do this ourselves. We can't rely on a WTO system that already, I think, has shown not to be really fit for purpose. But within this space, I think there have also been some really progressive and positive elements that civil society can use. In April 2022, already the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination basically said that global vaccine inequity, and we need to use this language, remember, for HIV, for TB, for monkeypox, a range of other diseases that we're going to be facing going forward. And it stated that a pattern of unequal distribution within and between countries replicates slavery and colonial era racial hierarchies and deepens structural inequalities affecting vulnerable groups. And I think that is something that we could depend on and rely on, because there was an affirmation at that UN level that what we were talking about in terms of vaccine apartheid was actually applicable. The special rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism also basically issued a similar statement and talked about the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on people in Africa, people of African descent, people in Latin America and Asia. And remember, I'm mentioning this because I think that if we don't deal with the issue of racism, global health, human rights, health rights, and decolonizing global health, and understanding that every voluntary license that's announced, every hub that is established in the global south, every kind of attempt to have technology transfer is deeply rooted in assumptions, right, around ability, around capability, and around race. And I think that's why the WHO hub is so important, because it was a response. The mRNA hub was a response to these claims, which we heard during the HIV/AIDS crisis, that people in Africa or Asia or Latin America can't do anything, are unable to tell time, don't have good quality control standards, etc. So I mentioned, the open letter from the special rapporteur on racism and racial discrimination, the UN committee declaration, because just about, I think it was a week ago, 2 weeks ago, the UN Human Rights Council, and yes, it may not be enforceable, and it's a resolution and it has limited impact, but again, it recognized, and I think this is such a useful tool for civil society, that access to medicines, vaccines, and other health products in the context of the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health is something that should be promoted. And so the Council, the Human Rights Council, called upon all member states to promote timely, equitable, and unhindered access to safe, effective, quality, affordable medicines, vaccines, diagnostics, therapeutics, and other health products and technologies for all, and not just limited to COVID. So I think there is some breathing room and great spaces to be able to advocate that. And we obviously need researchers and scientists to be part of those declarations, to be part of those frameworks of how we think about access in relation to health products. So my suggestion, it links to the work we've been doing with Jamie and many others, but what we have been disappointed with is not just the lack of solidarity or the fact that I had to wait months longer than many of you in the global north just to get my first vaccine, or so to my parents or my grandparents, got it way after my friends who were young, who had no comorbidities in the US, for example. But if we are going to have to address all of these issues that are a barrier to access going forward, because you can do all the science you want to, you can come up with all the revolutionary advances you want to. If there is no true benefit sharing agreements post-trial, if there is no proper governance of how these trials are being conducted in our country, we did 4 vaccine trials, we did the HIV prevention injection trial, we were not guaranteed access. We were not even in the front of the queue. Right? So this extractionist way of doing clinical trials, of doing science, that then benefits very few people at the right time. So it may benefit us, but it may take 10 years to get us HIV medicines. It may take us 3 years to get the HIV prevention injection. It took us a year before we had sufficient supplies of vaccines. And I mean, we were one of the outliers in Africa. There are other countries who were still waiting for supplies well into 2022. Then science is not going to benefit anyone except, I think, the pockets of very, very wealthy CEOs who've made billions in the last 2 years off the back of public research, especially the mRNA technology. So if we're going to reform the system, we have to deal with the WTO. It's a member-based institution. It has 164 member states. It's supposed to operate on the basis of consensus, but you can't operate on the basis of consensus when the US and the EU and a handful of countries have so much of power and trade power that they threaten repercussions in other trade spaces if you don't agree to certain things. And that is why we have, our assessment is why we have this really bad deal. You had 63 countries, led by South Africa and India from the global south saying, this is what we need to respond to this pandemic. And it was rejected. The EU came with a counter proposal and said everybody should issue compulsory licenses when they know that that's difficult to do. And when countries have tried to issue a compulsory license, they've either been blocked by a pharmaceutical company, like is happening in Bolivia, in the Dominican Republic with Pfizer, in Canada with Johnson & Johnson and BioLease, or they are trade threats to basically issuing a compulsory license, like we saw in the early days of the HIV/AIDS crisis when the pharmaceutical industry basically litigated against the Mandela administration in South Africa. And I think the difference this time, Edward, compared to the HIV/AIDS situation was at least this time the waiver proposal was very quickly supported by scientists, by researchers, by the Vatican, by Nobel laureates, by former world leaders. And despite, and obviously activists and groups around the world, but despite all of that support, this is the very bad deal we got. So, I'm really not sure whether in our lifetime we will actually see an equitable IP response to a pandemic unless we try and shift the goalposts a bit. And we've seen that same opposition by particularly the EU, the UK, the US, to language that was supposed to be included in this Human Rights Council resolution. They really nitpicked on certain words because there is a resistance to two things: compulsory measures by states who can use state action. The government of Indonesia could, the government of South Africa could, the government of Australia could, but also the recognition that we're trying to push for, that health and human rights technologies that can address that should be seen as public goods, not as commodities. There is a resistance to agree and to accept that because it is primarily a profit-seeking model and a profit, in my view, a gouging model. So just as I conclude, want to deal with quickly the mRNA hub in South Africa and then just some suggestions going forward. The mRNA hub in South Africa that Soumya talked about is significant. It's important because it was established as a response to what we regard as very racist assumptions. And they were articulated by the CEOs of pharmaceutical companies in the middle of this pandemic, who said that the mRNA technology is too difficult, nobody could figure it out, why should we set up a plant in Africa, nobody would be able to reverse engineer, there's no capacity, there's no ability. The New York Times, MSF showed there were at least 110 different options in the global south that could actually quickly, if the technology was shared, we could have scaled up manufacturing, we all could have had vaccines already at maybe the first and second variant. We wouldn't have to wait for the third, fourth, or fifth variant. But that technology sharing was refused, and up until today, it's still refused. The WHO issued expressions of interest and said, based on the fact that this technology was initially publicly funded, and that's the patent dispute that Jamie had alluded to earlier, but also that the knowledge came off the backs of public scientists at the NIH, of researchers in West Africa that had worked on Ebola, for example. So there's a history to how all of a sudden, you just got a Moderna or a Pfizer mRNA vaccine within the space of, not even 12 months, because it's off the back of a lot of work that had been done before. But the model is quite interesting, like Soumya said, because the WHO basically said, well, we're just going to set it up in Africa, and we're going to prove a point that there can be one collaboration among scientists across the world, and that's already happening. And the idea is to use the hub in South Africa, and they've established 15 spokes. Indonesia is one of those spokes that will receive. Brazil is another spoke, and there's at least 15 other countries, some in Africa, some Asia, and some Latin America, to basically show that the global South, one, can develop the necessary technology for vaccine production, but two, can then take that technology, transfer the technology, scale up knowledge, but then also start scaling up manufacturing. The question, of course, is will the IP regime that I've talked about then enable those spoke countries and those manufacturers to be able to, one, commercialize those vaccines and then send them across to different countries without any kind of export restrictions or threats. And the reason why we say that there is a cloud hanging over the mRNA hub, and even we will defend it to the hilt, we will support it to the hilt, is that when the WHO announced that they were going to establish the mRNA hub in South Africa, Moderna filed its patents. Now, remember, this is against a backdrop of a waiver that is we're trying to achieve, a very bad WTO deal that has emerged, no real kind of leeway around IP on vaccines, and a Moderna patent dispute with the US government in the US. But where Moderna is not sharing the technology with the WHO CTAP pool, not a single vaccine manufacturer has entered that pool. So, this assumption of you ask vaccine manufacturers nicely in the middle of a pandemic and that they voluntarily share knowledge. Well, people ask, and it hasn't happened. Not a single vaccine manufacturer in CTAP, and both Moderna and Pfizer are not cooperating with the mRNA hub in South Africa, leaving these scientists to kind of reverse engineer, figure it out themselves, and it's going to take longer. And remember, the mRNA hub is not just, hopefully, for a COVID vaccine, it's also potentially for HIV, TB, malaria, and other neglected diseases that countries in the global south feel that northern manufacturers or northern clinicians or northern researchers don't give enough attention to. So within that context, when the hub is established, Moderna files patents in South Africa, and the patents have been granted. Right. Moderna says that it won't enforce its patents in some of the countries during the crisis, but it hasn't given a written assurance for the freedom to operate for the mRNA hub in South Africa. So the important thing is why we try and protect the hub in South Africa from any kind of IP challenge or attack. The spokes, including Indonesia, need to make sure that they have the domestic kind of protections necessary so that if the technology is successfully transferred to those spokes and they are able to manufacture and scale up, that they are able to supply countries in their regions and in the global south at an affordable level. So, finally, in conclusion, there are many elements we're going to have to focus on as civil society, but if we only focus on the simple, easy things, we're not going to be able to get access. So we have to interrogate and study every single voluntary license that's being issued on COVID or HIV, whether it's the, Cabla, the HIV prevention injection, the new license that's been announced on Paxlovid, which, for example, excludes Brazil. That license excludes Brazil. Those kind of voluntary measures are not sufficient. Whether our countries will make use of compulsory licenses, you need to contact, your patent officers, you need to contact your minister, the equivalent of trade and industry in each government to see what is going to be possible, what parts are we going to push and what parts are we just going to accept an industry norm? How are we going to deal with affordability and pricing? How are we going to deal with post-trial access benefit sharing agreements? Because frankly, we just tired of companies coming to Africa in particular, testing a whole range of technologies on Black and brown people in our continent, and then not guaranteeing us any access or affordable access and preventing generic entries in competition because of the invocation of intellectual property rules and particularly patent protection. Jamie and others have talked about the pandemic treaty and supporting organizations that are providing oversight of because there too there's a resistance to recognizing that IP is a barrier to recognizing health goods as public goods. And so the resistance is coming in, I think, from multiple elements. And then I've explained some of the issues that we need to focus on in relation to the mRNA hub and the spokes. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. That was an excellent presentation and brought up very many points of, which need to be addressed etc. Again, Dr. Swami Nathan talked about linking data platforms. Given the fact that they are also linking in from lower middle income countries, to what extent can the quid pro quo of using the data being that the fruits of those results actually go to the areas where they've done the work. Look, there are many issues, and I hope you'll be able to stick around for the discussion to bring those up. I think we need to sort of move on now, and the next speaker, which we're very grateful that she's attending, is Priya Basu. She's the head of the Women's Finance Initiative at the World Bank. She's been a long-standing member of the World Bank. I don't know, but I should tell you since when, but she arrived as a young professional, and she's worked as a manager, vice president, etc. And she had one of her last appointments, and correct me if I'm wrong, Priya, was that you actually involved with the process of setting up the issue about pandemic threats and things like that, amongst other things. Anyway, Priya, thanks again. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Edward, and thank you to the organizers, the T20 group, for inviting me. Actually, I'm no longer the head of the Women Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative. That was way back. I think that my CV may not have been updated. So I wear a few hats at the World Bank, and one of those is that I run the Multilateral Leaders Task Force on COVID-19 that was set up last year. Jointly between the World Bank, the IMF, the WHO, and the World Trade Organization. I also am leading the development of the Financial Intermediary Fund for Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness, and Response. And more broadly, I lead the bank's engagement at the sort of the intersection of health and finance. So it's been a busy 2 years. I've been at the bank for 23 years now, but I have to say these last 2 years have been extremely intense. As you know, or you may have heard, the World Bank's COVID response has been the largest and fastest in our history. Initially, we worked on saving lives in the face of the pandemic. We provided critical life-saving equipment, PPE, etc., kind of in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. And then we focused on protecting livelihoods through all kinds of cash transfer and safety net programs, as we saw the massive economic losses that lockdowns were generating. And then as soon as vaccines became available, we started working on vaccine delivery. And then, of course, if 2021 was the year of trying to get vaccines from paper to ports and airports, 2022 has been about trying to get shots into people's arms, from ports into people's arms. So we've been heavily involved in that. We've supported developing countries with COVID-19 emergency health and vaccine operations in more than 100 countries, with over $14 billion in support for vaccines. The vaccine doses procured with World Bank financing through COVAX cost-sharing mechanisms have now been fully delivered as agreed with client countries. We continue to work very closely with the COVID-19 Vaccine Delivery Partnership, which is led by Ted Chaiban, which has identified 34 countries needing the most urgent attention. I'm glad to say that, in January, the list was 34. That list is now narrowing, which is good news. But these are the countries that need the most urgent attention to achieve their goals of vaccine coverage. And to promote vaccinations amongst the most vulnerable healthcare workers, elderly populations, people with comorbidities. So we're working kind of on that agenda, trying to get shots into people's arms, because we do believe in vaccines, and we do believe that as this virus has continued to mutate, vaccines remain highly effective at reducing serious illness and death, and they're the most important tool for helping countries save lives and get on a path to recovery. I have to say it's been a bit of a challenge in the past few months as priorities have shifted, but we're trying to get countries to really stay focused on vaccinating those who are most vulnerable. Now, as we work to end this pandemic, we're making efforts to get prepared to help low and middle income countries get prepared for the next pandemic. We want to avoid the kind of cycle of panic and neglect that we've seen in the past. In the past, we've seen that, a series of pandemics from avian influenza to SARS to MERS to Ebola to Zika, all generated interest, but then as soon as the pandemic was over, we fell into a cycle of neglect and, then got surprised by the next pandemic that came. And it's not a question of when, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when the next pandemic is going to hit us. So we're really determined to learn from the lessons of this pandemic to make sure that we help countries make those investments that are needed to prevent and prepare for future pandemics. So with that in mind, and I have to thank G20 Indonesia and Italy for the leadership role that they've been playing in maintaining the focus on preparing for the next pandemic. There was a suggestion made by the G20 high-level independent panel last year to set up a new financial intermediary fund for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response at the World Bank. And that topic was taken up in the context of the G20 Finance and Health Task Force, co-chaired by Indonesia and Italy, where the World Bank, I myself, along with colleagues from WHO, have been very actively involved over the past few months. And that has calmed all those discussions and deliberations within the G20 with the leadership of Italy and Indonesia, and also the leadership of the US, have culminated in a proposal to set up this new financial intermediary fund. And this was then approved by the World Bank's Board of Executive Directors on June 30th. And the purpose of this new financial intermediary fund is that it will bring additional dedicated resources for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response for low and middle income countries through investments at the national, regional, and global level, but focused on really getting those countries, developing countries, equipped to be able to face the next pandemic, so that we don't face the kind of problems that Fatima and other colleagues have been mentioning, the deep inequities, the deep problems in timely, affordable, equitable access to critical life-saving tools. This fund, I'm pleased to share that we've already mobilized $1.3 billion from 11 donors, and they also from 11 sovereign donors, and from 3 foundations, including the Wellcome Trust, who I believe is joining this webinar. And so we have now 14 donors, and we have several more who have expressed interest and intent to participate in this fund. We're working very closely with the WHO in developing this, and also obviously with our donor partners, and engaging very widely with stakeholders, with civil society, with the private sector, with the potential beneficiary countries of this fund. So what will the fund do? How will it add value? It's not a new institution. We don't want to crowd the global health finance space with yet another new institution. The idea of this fund, therefore, is that it will sit within the World Bank, hosted by the World Bank, with a small secretariat that will be staffed jointly by World Bank and WHO staff. And it will work through existing global health institutions. So it'll work through the range of UN organizations, including WHO, UNICEF, and others, the multilateral development banks that are involved in the space, specialized global health agencies like Gavi, CEPI, Global Fund, etc. It will work through those, channel funds through those entities with a focus on strengthening capacity at the country, regional, and global level for PPR. And we also hope that in the process of channeling funds, it will incentivize countries to make their own investments. And just to share that for the G20, we had prepared a series of joint reports with the WHO, and one of them was to assess needs and gaps for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. And we estimated that about $30 billion per year over the next 5 years is needed to fill key IHR capacity gaps to get countries up their international health regulation standards. And of those $30 billion per year, external financing can probably provide about a third of that, so about 10 to 10.5 billion a year. But the 2/3 of that gap needs to come from domestic resources through country commitments. So through this fund, while the fund is one part of the solution, and it will augment additional international financing for PPR, we want to make sure that every dollar of the grant money that this fund provides will incentivize investments by countries themselves. So that's kind of one important goal of this fund. Another one is that we see a lot of players in the global health space, not necessarily well coordinated. So our aim is to structure this in a way that it again incentivizes and encourages various external partners to work together at the country level around the national plans that countries have, around their NAFs and other types of national plans for pandemic preparedness. So we'll find a way that the money kind of encourages coordination on the ground where the rubber hits the road. We also believe it can serve as a platform for advocacy. It will be designed in a way that it's as flexible as possible. I already mentioned that it will work through existing entities, complementing their efforts, not kind of crowding out anyone, but rather encouraging more to be spent in a dedicated way on PPR. We're very mindful of the comments we've received from stakeholders to balance inclusivity in the design and operations of the fund with agility in its governance and in operating arrangements. There'll be a strong focus on transparency and accountability. So all this to say that, right now we're in an intense phase of designing this. We got the initial approval from the World Bank's board on June 30th for the bank to serve as the financial trustee, to host the secretariat, and to be one of the implementing partners. But the work has really now begun and in earnest, and we're working with the group of donors, with WHO, to design this. Along the way, we'll be continuing to consult a variety of stakeholders, including private sector, civil society, recipient countries, and so on, to get this fund designed, as efficiently and as well as possible. And then the goal is to soft launch it in September. And of course, we'll continue to build upon it, but we do want to get it in action. We want to get it up and running. There is an urgency. There is a moment that we want to seize right now. Before we're on the other side of this pandemic, we want to kind of make sure that we're prepared for the next one. So we're working with urgency. Lastly, to say that we had put out a white paper on this in May. We received a lot of comments, about 300 pages of comments, but the consultations don't end there. Over the summer, we're going to do more targeted consultations with various stakeholder groups. And we really do hope that this fund can play an important role in making sure that low and middle income countries are better prepared and are able to prevent the next pandemic. And when it does hit, then they're able to respond to it in a manner that ensures equitable access to the kinds of sort of medical countermeasures that we've been talking about in this webinar today. And just lastly on that piece itself, so we're still there's a high level scope of the fund that's been defined. But in terms of what each individual call for proposals will finance, that's something that we're still designing. And that's kind of one key piece of the consultations that we're doing, because we want to make sure that the resources that this fund provides kind of really serve the needs of the countries that the fund is designed to help. So country level strengthening of core capacities will be at the center of this. Areas like disease surveillance, strengthening labs, health workforce capacity, community engagement, emergency communications and management. These kind of core capabilities will be strengthened, and as well as around One Health and the OIE standards. So that's at the country level. But at the same time, this pandemic has also shown us the power of regional institutions, like the Africa CDC, PAHO, and so on. So we're keen to also utilize this fund to help strengthen regional capacity and build new capacity where it doesn't exist. And that is things like, shared public health assets, disease surveillance reporting and information sharing, sort of networking up from the country to the regional to the global level, regulatory harmonization, building capacity for coordinated development, procurement, and deployment of vaccines and other medical countermeasures. We've been talking about developing manufacturing hubs and so on, where it makes sense to get those ever-warm manufacturing capacities in place so that they can be quickly surged when a crisis strikes. So those are the kinds of areas that this fifth, as we call it, a financial intermediary fund, will help. And we look forward to continuing our discussions. And I've really found this webinar fascinating and taken a lot of notes. And I'll be reaching out to many of you after this to discuss, and to brainstorm as we develop the fund. So thank you so much for your attention, and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Priya. This was great, and it was really puts what's happening at a global level in perspective, and it also brings you've brought down back to where the rubber really hits the road, which are the countries, and it's all very nice for us to talk at a sort of global level, but again, then can the countries move on that? And as Fatima has already indicated, there's a number of restrictions as well as opportunities. So I really hope that both of you are able to stick around for the discussion, because I think there's a lot to discuss. We're going to have Jeremy Farah now, Director of the Wellcome Trust. Unfortunately, he had to leave. But as Priya just already indicated, I mean, the Wellcome Foundation, sorry, I should say, is actually supporting the PPR process at the bank and things like that. So we'll come back to that later on. What we now want to do is, before the discussion, we will have a video by Javier Guzman, who's the Director of Global Health Policy and a Senior Policy Fellow at the Center of Global Development. He was previously worked with USAID and was the technical director on medicine technologies and pharmaceutical services program at the Management Sciences for Health organization. So a lot of things there, but so if we're ready to roll, let's do that. And then we will have a short break after the discussion, and then we will have we'll have some time for, some break after the video, and then have the discussion following that. Adia, if you can start, that would be great.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Javier Guzman, and I'm the director of the Global Health Policy Program at the Center for Global Development. I'm going to talk today a bit about optimizing access to vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. A bit about the Center for Global Development. We are an independent, not-for-profit, not partisan policy think tank based in Washington, D.C. and in London. We've been around for 20 years, and we focus on global public goods, always with an economics and financing perspective. You see here the research areas where we work, including global health policy, and I invite you to visit our website and see our work. But let's get started with the topic today. What are the lessons we've learned from the pandemic in terms of access to health technologies? The first one is we shouldn't be talking about access to medicines anymore. We should be talking about access to health technologies. We saw the importance of vaccines, medical devices, including point-of-care diagnostics, oxygen, and other technologies. So it's not just about medicines. Secondly, the world focused a lot on research and development, developing new products, developing new vaccines, new diagnostics, but that was just the beginning, and the problem shouldn't be seen in a sequential manner. It's not that first we develop the products and then we think about deployment or we think about registration. And development is just the beginning. Importantly, funders should include, think about what provisions they put in place to guarantee access down the line. Third point, it is about demand. It is about effective demand. A lot of the conversation was focused on supply, was focused on increasing vaccine manufacturing capacity, but interesting work conducted by the World Bank and published earlier this year shows how lack of timely financing was responsible for a big chunk of the delay in terms of accessing new COVID vaccines. So there should be effective demand, and that effective demand involves financing, but also involves having the adequate legal arrangements for governments to negotiate and to procure health technologies. The fourth point I wanted to say is, at the end of the day, the limiting factor here is the capacity on the ground. And we saw how systems were not prepared to deploy health technologies, and there wasn't any resilient, robust health systems able to, deploy, increase the oxygen deployment or increase the deployment of COVID vaccines. So it is important to think about the health system. It is important to think about public health functions. It is important to prepare going forward. The fifth element, the fifth lesson, has to do with adequate governance arrangements. With the response to COVID, we saw how a lot of the existing institutions quickly shifted to, respond to COVID. That was important, that was needed, but there was an element of, lack of trust. There was an element of, lack of accountability, lack of ownership. A lot of the countries and some regions didn't feel represented in the decisions made in Geneva. So it is important that the governance arrangements are revisited, are put in place, going forward in the best possible way. And last but not least, I think it's important to acknowledge that there's always a trade-off between, policy goals in relation to access. We historically have favored economies of scale, have favored having few suppliers concentrated in a few countries in relation to vaccines, for instance, vaccines and immunization products for the EPI immunization vaccines, and that's how Gavi has worked in the past. But clearly that geographical concentration increased the risk in the moment of a pandemic, increased the risk related to export bans, related to not having enough suppliers and not having enough platforms and a resilient system to respond to the pandemic. So those are my 6 key reflections in terms of the lessons learned. There might be many more, but I've prioritized this. Now the question is, what should we do going forward? What elements should we consider going forward? And the first one I would mention is sufficient and timely financing. I said how important and how detrimental it had been to not to have the finances in a timely fashion with the COVID pandemic for vaccines. Now, going forward, there should be financing, and that financing should be adequate and should be enough to procure products at risk, should be enough to, being able to order early, and that will basically provide the right incentives for developers and manufacturers. The second has to do with the governance arrangements. There's a clear shift towards regional platforms. We see that in Africa, we see that in Latin America, and that is important. It basically increases ownership, increases responsiveness, but there needs to be an element of coordination to make sure that we have a global system. And that is currently work in progress. So importantly, there needs to be a global health architecture that is fit for purpose, that does have a clear interaction between the regional and the global and the national decision-making structures. The research and development, we saw how it is extremely important and on all the different products, but provisions should be put in place to make sure that access is embedded within the arrangements, and I think funders will play a role and should play a role in this regard. Manufacturing should be more diversified. That will increase resilience, that will increase responsiveness, but there needs to be sustainability here, and that's something that hasn't been discussed very much in the past year. We've seen a lot of pledges, we've seen a lot of investments into manufacturing of vaccines in different countries, in different regions, but the due diligence has not been fully completed, and the coordination is work in progress as well. We've seen the problem with Aspen in South Africa, where the factory was built but the demand was not there. So there's an element of sustainability that needs to be guaranteed going forward, and this has to do with not just with medical countermeasures for a new pandemic, new infectious disease threats, but also looking holistically at the need of essential health technologies and how the systems that are put in place for manufacturing, for deployment, for supply chains can be used for routine immunizations, can be used for the routine health problems that countries face, and that is important going forward. Last but not least, I think the neglected element of strengthening health systems should be addressed, cannot be neglected anymore. And here we talk about human resources, we talk about information systems being able to perform the key public health functions, including regulation, and that is essential because it will help not only pandemic preparedness, it will help basic response to the infectious disease threats and any other health concerns at the national level. We saw how health systems are the limiting factor in the deployment of health interventions and health technologies. So those are my key reflections and key elements to consider. Thank you very much. I wish you very fruitful discussions and conversations. These are my contact details in case you want to follow up on any of these issues. Thanks a lot.
Well, thanks, Javier, although he can't hear us. That was, I thought, another excellent summary of some of the issues that we need to address. Time is running out. So initially I was going to suggest, are there any specific points of clarification to address to Priya? Unfortunately, Fatima had to leave to another meeting. But please, if there are any particular reason, any questions, put it in the chat. What I perhaps can follow up with is, Priya, I think that the whole development of the fifth and pandemic preparatory response is very exciting, because it does really need a global coordination as well as what's happening at regional and national level. It raises the question, though, what are we? Is this process going to be focused on? Because the pandemic there are acute phenomena, process of a pandemic, but then you have sequelae of a pandemic. For instance, if you look at HIV, we recognize it in the late 1970s, early 80s, and again, it's been a process which has gone over time, from an acute to a medium and to a long-term process. And similarly, this will probably be the same with COVID, as well as the other pandemics that we have, TB, we have NCDs and things like that. So that's one question. Then that beggars the question, the preparation. So when we talk about preparations, are we talking only about the acute event of the new pandemic, new agent? Or, as Javier suggests, should we also be looking at the healthcare infrastructure in countries? Because again, if the resources are there, being human resources and buildings and whatever, all the things it need, it's usually one is in a better position to respond to new threats than what is it, although it's just still going to generate stress. And that then sort of comes back to R for the response. Again, is the response just the acute phase or the medium and long-term phase? Because globally, we can sort of say we want to do the acute phase, but at the end of the day, again, the medium and the long-term phases are very much country-driven, and that's where the sort of the onus lies. And this is not to criticize the process, not at all, but actually, just like Javier said, how can we actually put this process in the context of actually what a number of other speakers have Mrna talked about, how diagnostic procurement and use at national level. And having spent quite a long time in the UN, we've always talked what happens at country level, because that's where actually things are happening. So this is Priya, if you have any response or anybody else, that'd be great. And alternatively, if people want to come up with questions through the Q&A, please do so.
Sure. So I'm happy to jump in. And really, this is a good opportunity to clarify that, if I hadn't already made it clear, this fifth is about investing in capacities at the country, regional, and global level to prepare for the next pandemic. So, it's not so much about response financing. Response, the more you invest in prevention and preparedness, the less you need to spend, in surge financing when the pandemic hits. And, one thing that COVID-19 has shown us is that, international organizations do, kind of step up when it comes to response. The question is, how can we work with countries and regional partners to strengthen capacity to prepare? So exactly the kinds of things you're talking about, and maybe just in terms of one framework that we've developed with the WHO, and this might help clarify a bit, you think of it in terms of there's kind of 5 areas that need attention. There's the whole sort of collaborative surveillance area, there's community protection, there's access to countermeasures, sort of investing in countermeasures so that there is equitable, affordable access, and there's clinical care. And then there's emergency coordination that brings all of this together. And on the collaborative surveillance side, the kinds of activities that we want this fifth to invest in are sort of strengthen national integrated disease threat and vulnerability surveillance, increase lab capacity for pathogens and genomic surveillance, collaborative approaches for risk forecasting, event detection, response monitoring, so that kind of piece. Then on community protection is to do with sort of proactive risk communication and sort of pandemic, infodemic management to inform communities and build trust, and that takes time. It's a kind of intergenerational process, so it requires kind of long-term investments. Then the whole kind of area of community engagement to co-create public health and social measures based on local contexts and customs. Then multi-sectoral action to address community concerns such as social welfare and livelihood protection. Then on clinical care, it's to do with building capacity for safe and scalable emergency care, for infection prevention and control, health systems that can maintain essential health services during emergencies. So you got to make that, again, long-term intergenerational investments in health systems capacity. And this is kind of a core piece for the World Bank. We have an active portfolio of about $30 billion in over 100 countries on health system strengthening. So kind of doing more of that. And that's one thing the pandemic showed was that countries that had better health systems were able to deal with the pandemic better. We don't know what the next pandemic is going to be, so you got to make those investments. And again, those are long-term investments. And then on the access to countermeasures side, fast track R&D with the pre-negotiated benefit sharing agreements, scalable manufacturing platforms and agreements for technology transfer, coordinated procurement and emergency supply chains to ensure equitable access. And there's ways in which we can sort of, partner public and private sector to ensure that, mechanisms already in place that allow rich and poor countries alike to procure countermeasures when the next crisis hits. And then kind of bringing all of this together to have sort of, strengthened health emergency and report systems at the country level, coherent national action plans that are fully funded and that can actually sort of, don't just stay as action plans on, on shelves, but really begin to be implemented. Just much better coordination systems so that countries are geared up to deal with, kind of a big pandemic when it occurs. So again, just to say that this is we're really thinking long term here. We recognize that this is this can't happen in a generation. So that's why it requires sustained financing, and that's why I've been highlighting that whatever we provide through external financing, it has to be sustained through domestic investments and domestic commitment to the agenda, and we cannot let short time horizons of governments put these important issues kind of outside of the agenda when other crises happen. And already we're in the midst of food crisis, fuel crisis, inflation. There are so many crises. So how do you kind of ensure that governments keep the focus on this agenda at the same time? And of course, finance is one piece of it, but we're hoping that through this finance we can actually maintain sustained political commitment to this agenda. So I don't know, Edward, if I've answered your question, but
you've answered very fully. But it would be great, and we really appreciate that. But if you can actually sort of send us a link or where people can actually follow up on some of the details of this. We're running out of time now. Rosanna has a question.
Yeah.
A quick one.
Hi. Yeah, I'll be very quick. I agree with everything that Priya says, but I think in reality, in many countries, because we have this emphasis on cost effectiveness, so quite often when you see elimination programs, as countries go towards elimination, then cost per case detected becomes very high. And countries would say, well, this is no longer cost effective if it takes $10,000 for us to detect the last few cases. So that's why quite often the tasks are never finished in terms of, you know, like trying to eliminate something. And so, and that's the reality. You know, countries need to allocate their resources towards other acute problems, right? And so I think part of it has to be that countries need to strengthen their prevention programs so that you would transition into prevention mode rather than, you know, trying to insist on cost effectiveness. And so if we heard from the beginning from the Indonesian government, they only spend 17% of their health dollars on prevention. And I think that there should be a little bit more balance between prevention and treatment and etc. So, so this is part of what I was going to add to you, answered Ed's question.
Thank you. A quick response, Priya. Are you happy?
I fully agree. And so, you know, maybe I was going too fast when I was speaking earlier, but One Health and kind of the whole prevention agenda is very important. And so, you know, that's kind of at the country level, we're very focused on that. So I agree, Rosanna, and thank you. Thank you for highlighting that.
Great.
Okay, I think as far as I'm been told, we're running out of time now. So, Virginia, do you want to take over the proceedings from here?
Thanks so much. Thanks, Eddie, and thanks to all of our participants and presenters. I feel like my head is exploding with information, and really it's been a very dynamic discussion. Somehow we're going to try and piece together a lot of this into a report with recommendations. For those of you who are able to review or provide input, we would really appreciate it. Some of you will have reached your bandwidth as far as your input to this process, and that's also understood, but there'll certainly be an opportunity to continue to provide any feedback. So thank you very, very much. I'm going to now hand over to Professor Hasbullah Thrabani, who has agreed to close the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Virginia. I'm sorry that I missed at the beginning because I was in the middle of the discussion in National Association of Hospitals meeting. I've been monitoring though, but not talking. I've been very happy to hear a lot of debate, a lot of issues discussed during this discussion. I would like to thank for this coordination from Virginia and Edward for the great moderating this session. Thanks also for Claudia, for James and Professor Rosanna, for Ahmad Iqbal, also Fatima and Priya and Jeremy for the contribution. I can see that there is a light for the futures, for all of us in the world can have a better prepare for if there is happening pandemic or epidemic, but no one expected, but we have to be prepared. There are still several issues though that we still have to delineate, describe more detail on the balance, the trade-off between the full fund meeting the need and demand, and there is also some potential misuse and so on that will be discussed in future. What next is that we have to submit kind of our proposed or policy brief to the G20 meeting, to G20 summit in Bali later this year. I hope that after this we can write down and get a response from all of you. Thank you very much for the great contribution, and I hope that we are together can contribute to the betterness of healthier planet in this planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
Thanks.
And Eddie, did
Thank
you want to just say a final word?
Thank you all very much. It's been a great webinar. I mean, I usually don't wake up till midday. I mean, I'm a night person, but this time I was awake for most of the time, and I think you've all been brilliant. And I'm afraid that this is not a sort of that Western, but I'm going to clap all of the presenters and the participants.
Thank you. Thank you for all our team of Virginia and Beck and our Chance Universitas Indonesia for this organization. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.